Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to present the keynote speech for the conference. And today I want to talk about a paper joined with Judy Owens from University of Nottingham on the motivations behind NGOs. I will be looking at their activity diversification decision, and I will be giving a few thoughts and empirical evidence from Uganda on why and how they decide on their activity portfolio. So this speech is going to be based on a joint paper with Trudy named Non-Governmental Organizations, Motivation to Diversify. We'll be looking at two broad incentives, the self-interest or operation-related reasons. We'll be using the data of very unique and representative data from Uganda to give some empirical evidence for the paper. I'm very glad and grateful for the conference organizers to invite me to give this speech. Now, this is the outline of the talk. I will be speaking about the motivations of the research, a conceptual model in which we lay out the theoretical foundation of our paper. We're talking about the data and the methodology on how we would identify the causal effects of incentives on diversification. I will be talking about the results and finally giving some discussion and some concluding remarks. Now, motivation. So why are we interested in the activity diversification decision of an NGO? As you can imagine, non-profits or NGOs around the world usually started as some single activity organizations. They're trying to do something good, but over time, they would expand their offerings. They could try to offer more and more activities or services to a wider range of people. Now, the very much noble motivation behind this expansion in their activities is to accommodate more social demands, right? They would be trying to accommodate a wider range of people, a wider range of beneficiaries. Especially after the huge funding initiatives towards Africa in the 2008, 2009, this pattern has already become more and more popular. From the economics and management perspective, diversifying is not always a good choice. It is a costly and potentially harmful activity to development efforts of NGOs and other non-profit organizations. The main reason for this is by diversifying to many other activities, those organizations would be losing the focus, would be losing the overarching objectives that they declared when they opened activity. From the economics and management point of view, this involves an increase in transaction cost. It involves an increase in management efficiency, through which the NGOs might be wasting their resources on trying to diversify. The creation of more and more activities would be a problem of creating this image of mission vagueness, right? So it reduced the legitimacy and privileges associated with being an NGO or being a non-profit. The more activities also mean a stronger need to oversee their operation. And especially in developing countries, it is getting harder and harder for the public, for donors to have effective regulatory mechanisms to oversee their activities and their management. And the current, global crisis of trust and credibility of the sector, the non-governmental organization sector, the charity sector, really put a huge question mark on their motivations and motives behind their decision to expand their activities. In terms of academic interest, we believe that this paper has a huge conclusion, a huge application in trying to understand the motivation behind people's pro-social behaviors. If we understand why NGOs are doing what they claim they're doing, it could be very much useful for us to design schemes to incentivize pro-social activities. It's not just for the NGOs, but also for individuals. Most of the literature has been focused on the ethics of businesses or the ethics of for-profit organizations regarding their diversification activity and regarding their motivations behind their decision. There is pretty much little studies have been done on NGOs. So we're trying to contribute to this extent literature. There are a few challenges associated with studying the motivations behind an NGO activity. The first one is that it is not easy to elicit such information. We can't really go around and ask people to tell us their deep motivation behind their decision. And there's not much of conceptual theoretical framework to interpret the results effectively. So these are the biggest motivations behind our approach to understand an NGO's motivation. The way we do it is to offer a theoretical approach and an empirical approach to answer this question. From the theoretical side of it, we will try to look at different motivations behind an NGO's decision. And then I will categorize those motivations into two broad incentives. The first one is operation-related incentives. So NGOs would decide to expand their activities to reduce some random risks related to their operation. For example, if they happen to close because of some natural disasters or some sudden change in a donor targets or preferences, or some shortage of labor because of some macroeconomic conditions, or to address the cost complementarity between activities. So basically, the first broad incentive is about ensuring financial security related to their operation. The second reason, very broad one, that NGOs would try to offer more activities, more services, is related to personal gains from doing so. It could be the managers trying to advance their career. It could try to entrench themselves with a prolonged relationship with donors. It could be to earn some privileges or some perks from offering more and more activities, or it could be some pure altruism. Okay, I will be talking about the motivations behind each of these motives and how we would model them in the theoretical model. We incorporate those broad incentives in a theoretical model to predict the following observations. We predict that if the NGO's decision-making is dominated by the operation-related motives, then an increase in income, a sudden increase in income, would be associated with a decrease in diversification. The intuition here is pretty simple. The intuition is that if the NGOs care about their financial security and they try to diversify to address the lack of financial security, an increase in income towards the NGO would reduce the concern of financial security for the NGOs, so that they can now focus on the overarching objective or the overarching activity that they would like to perform. So they don't have to diversify their activities. They can reduce the number of activities to focus on the core mission that they wanted. Now, on the contrary, if the decision-making of an NGO is dominated by the motives of gaining personal perks, so meaning that by diversifying more, they would be earning more personal gains, then an increase in income would now allow them to do so, right? Would now allow them to spend more on more activities or services to get more personal gains. So we predict that if the personal gains motive dominates the operation-related motives, a sudden increase in income will be associated with an increased diversification. Okay, we'll be using those theoretical predictions to guide our interpretation of the empirical results. For us to use to analyze the results, to analyze the theoretical predictions using empirical evidence, we're going to use a unique representative sample from Ugandan NGOs in 2008. So we'll be collecting the data at the end of 2008, and we are going to exploit the historic flood in NGO and in Africa in the middle of 2007 as the source of exogenous variation. We are going to observe that following this historic flood in 2007, there was a surge in contractual income, meaning that incomes are targeted to some regions and to some areas with from the international donors to NGOs working in some severely affected districts. The surge in the income would act as the treatment in our analysis. Okay, we're observing that NGOs who have been working in the severely affected areas indeed received a higher funding, meaning that they received a higher income compared to all the NGOs who worked in the less affected areas. And we then observed that those NGOs who received higher income from international donors following the flood actually diversified less, actually offered fewer activities in 2008. This is consistent across a bunch of robustness checks and consistent with a different way that we use to identify the effects. If we use our theoretical model to guide how to interpret this, we see that it is consistent with our second prediction, it is consistent with our first prediction, in which we predict that the NGOs are mainly motivated by operational motives instead of to gain some personal perks. Okay, we'll be trying. I will talk about how we actually model this and how we will be using different empirical evidence to support our results. We believe that the paper is related to a bunch of other studies in the behavioral literature and the literature on charitable efforts. However, we want to emphasize that this is amongst the first papers that use development NGOs in a developing country to analyze and distinguish between the motivations behind an organization motivation. Okay, the main literature has been on the finance literature or on the for-profit organizations literature. There's little done on the NGO literature. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the conceptual framework now. In this case, I'm going to give you the broad intuitive approach to our conceptual model. For the full details, please refer to our paper appendix for the full model. So the first point I want to make is the whole mechanism through which the NGOs would decide their decision. Okay, so the mechanism is simply through the non-distributional constraint. What does it mean? It means that no profit or surplus from an NGO's activities could be distributed within the NGOs. So the NGO employees cannot distribute any profit or surplus from their income, from their donations, if they have any surplus. Okay. The problem with our developing countries is that this constraint is not effectively enforced or monitored by the donors or the public. There is a lot of evidence from the literature on how little the compliance to the sectoral norm established in developed countries of this pattern. We don't see much of this constraint being observed and compliant in developing countries. Okay, so our model would be using this mechanism to show how a sudden increase or an exogenous shock in income would affect the decision made by an NGO on the number of activities that they would offer. Okay, I'm going to talk about 5 main motives of an NGO. The first one is rent seeking and revenue maximization motive. What I mean here is that NGOs who are driven by the need to maximize their revenue, right? Because they would try to maximize the amount of donations or the amount of salaries given to the employees. An increase in the income would have either zero or positive effects on the number of activities that they offer. The intuition is very, very simple. Because I really care about maximizing the revenue. Now I have an increased revenue. Either I don't really care about increasing my offering, or I would try to offer more to gain more and more revenues in the future. Okay, so if an NGO is driven by the revenue maximization motive, an increase in the funding or an increase in income would be associated with a zero or positive increase in their diversification. Now, relatedly, if the NGOs are motivated mainly by personal perks maximization, for example, they will try to offer more and more activities to be able to claim more expenses, to be able to offer more offices, to go on additional trips, or to make the managers more desirable in the future job market, or for the managers to signal their competence, their experience, or advance their future career, or simply some egoistic gains, for example, to improve the prestige, the privileges associated with diversifying more, or the social status from running a diversified, complex activity portfolio. All of these personal perks maximization would have a positive effect on diversification, right? Now, the intuition is quite simple. If they are receiving more and more money that allow them to spend more on more activities, they would definitely take it. The higher the revenue, the higher the increase in income, the more they would diversify. If they aim to maximize social welfare, so think about they're purely altruistic, they're trying to help more and more people, offering more services, then this pure altruism would lead to an increase in diversification following an increase in the revenue. Okay, this is quite intuitive, actually. The fourth broad motive is operation related motives. So it could be to reduce risk associated with their operations. For example, in the future, if donors would cut off their funding, they're trying to make themselves more open, more accessible to future funding opportunities, or if they are doing a very good job at some activity, they're trying to expand to other related activity to use this cost complementarity, then an increase in funding would have a negative effect on diversification. The intuition is following. What they are truly worried about is financial security. If they are receiving a huge increase in income, meaning that their finance has been secured, they don't have to worry about expanding their activities, expanding their services anymore. So now they can focus on the core objective that they started. So to summarize, following those intuitions, we have two broad incentives of an NGO and how they would react following some extra revenue. If the NGOs are motivated by some personal gains, for example, maximizing the revenue or maximizing their personal perks, or simply to increase their warm glow, some good feeling from helping other people, then an increase in extra income would be associated with a higher level of diversification. Whereas if they are concerned about operation-related activities, for example, to reduce future risk associated with their finances, or as a way to complement their cost strategy, then an increase in revenue would be associated with a decrease in their level of diversification. So we will be trying to look at the empirical sign of the effect of an increase in contractual income on the diversification level, and we will be interpreting that as some indication of the dominating motivation behind an NGO. Okay, now how can we do it? So basically, we're trying to look at the effect of grants, in this case, an increase in revenue, on the number of on the number of activities that an NGO offered at the end of 2008. We'll be using a representative survey of the NGO sector at the end of 2008. We have about 400 NGOs, and we're trying to have a sampling process to represent the whole sector. And we have tons of information on their activities spanning in 2002 and 2007, information on their funding sources, employment, coverage, and some managers' background. To look at activities, diversification, we have the number of activities and some Hofindal-Hirschman index of activity spanning diversity. Okay, so in here, the ETA captures the proportion of their total costs spent on each activity. Okay, grants, our treatment variable, it is simply the proportion of income from contractual sources. So we are looking at donors and user and membership fees. So we will be looking, we would be excluding business incomes and voluntary donations. So these sources of income are not contractual, meaning that the NGOs can use those money as they want. Okay, we will be having a battery of control variables to reduce the opposite variable bias as well. Now, here is some reported activities at the end of 2008. Okay, so we have a wide range of activities, for example, education and training, community development and construction, and so on. Okay, so this is a good range of activities for Ugandan NGOs. A histogram of diversification at the end of 2008. So on average, NGOs in Uganda at the end of 2008 would have around 4 to 5 activities on average. The max of the activities offered by an NGO is around 10, and the minimum is about 1. Okay, so about 5%, 6% of the NGO offered only 1 activity. Now, of course, we have to worry about, so we are interested in the effect of a grant, so an increase in contractual income on on diversification. So we will be interested in this overall effect. Of course, we have to worry about this heterogeneity between income and diversification level. So what we are trying to solve for this problem is to look for an instrumental variable that could affect the diversification level only through this variable, treatment variable, contractual income. So we are going to exploit this shock in the working conditions of NGOs, and that would attract a higher grants, higher money, higher funding from the donors towards those severely affected NGOs. So we'll be looking at this 2007 historic flood and a surge in international funding towards Ugandan NGOs at the end of 2007. So around July to November 2007, there was a huge unexpected heavy rainfall in Uganda, affecting these districts of the country. And following this historic flood, in here I show this spike in the rainfall, average rainfall in 2007 to show the severity of the flood. Following this historic flood, there was a surge in humanitarian aid targeting the most affected regions. So our first stage is pretty simple. If an NGO was working in the most affected area, they would be receiving a very high level of income. Okay, they will be attracting a higher level of donations from international donors. Their business income are going to be affected as well because they wouldn't be able to offer business activities. So working in one of those affected area would be associated with a higher level of grants. Okay. So this is our first stage. And it works in our data. So having worked at the most affected area would be associated with a higher level of dependence on international donations or membership fees. Okay, so our first stage is pretty strong with a very high F value. Okay, so our second stage, we are worried about exclusion restriction. That is, having worked at the affected areas would really affect the outcome variable, so diversification, through the increase in the reliance on international donations only, right? So we have a few arguments for this satisfaction. So we argue that the timing of the flood was completely exogenous. It is an once in 100-year event, and heavy rainfall is pretty unpredictable for NGOs, so they cannot really choose themselves to work in these areas. Okay. We also use a bunch of data to show that NGOs cannot pre-select themselves into areas that are vulnerable to heavy floods. So we're looking at heavy floods from 1988 to 2017 to 2017, and we see that NGOs working at areas who were vulnerable to at least one extreme flood from 1988 to 2017 are statistically having no statistical difference from those who are working in the non-vulnerable area. So it's very hard for NGOs to choose themselves, to self-select themselves into working in those severely affected area in 2007. We also provide an indirect test for additionality. So the argument is following. If we believe that the exclusion restriction holds, then in a case when we do not have a first stage, so if following a flood, there would be no increase in the international funding towards the NGO, we should expect no effect of the flood working in the flood area on the diversification level. We performed this test by using a smaller flood in 2002, late 2001, early 2002, in which we didn't have this increase in international funding towards the area. So we have no first stage, no surge in funding towards the most affected areas, and we do not see a second stage or reduced form estimate as well. The affected NGOs did not change statistically their diversification. So the flood themselves did not directly affect the diversification level. So it supports our idea that the flood themselves would only affect the NGOs through the increase in the international funding. Okay. To further, consolidate our evidence, we're looking at some within NGO variation as well. So we have a few we have a few other questions on the number of introduced and discontinued activities since 2002. So we can sort of create this pseudo panel data. So we can have this panel data analysis as well. So we'll be looking at the change in the NGOs diversification from 2002 to 2007, and the change in the level of international funding and contractual income from NGOs, from international donations and membership fees from 2002 to 2007. And we will be able to capture organization and time fixed effect, and we're able to account for some time varying variables as well. We then perform another IV estimation using our 2007 floods as the instrument to capture the within and between variation of the NGOs. Now, the result, we got pretty much consistent results. So we all found, once we try to account for the heterogeneity, we get a negative result. The interpretation here is pretty interesting. So the estimate is around minus 2.44. Our interpretation is about 40% increase in the dependence of an NGO's revenue on international donation and membership fees. This 40% point increase is about one standard deviation change in their reliance on contractual income. This one standard deviation increase in the reliance on contractual income would be associated with about one activity one additional activity offered by the NGOs. So one activity is about a half of the variables standard deviation. Okay, so we believe that this increase is pretty meaningful and economically large. Okay, we have the same results for a bunch of robustness check, and even if we use within NGO variation. Okay, so we focus on the effects of the change in grants and diversification. So pretty much we have negative coefficients everywhere. Our conclusion is pretty simple. A higher reliance on international fundings from donors, members, and users would reduce diversification for Ugandan NGOs. This is consistent with our theoretical prediction that NGOs diversify mainly, so the keyword here is mainly, for risk reduction or cost complementarity of their operation. The intuition is pretty simple. Once they receive the financial security, they would now focus on their main objective, their main operational objective. So it is very, very encouraging to see that the motivation underlying NGOs' behavior is not self-benefiting, right? It's not about gaining personal gains or gaining personal perks, but it's more about securing their financial funding, their support in the future. So we would be trying to advocate for more and more support to help NGOs to feel secure about their future, the financial future, so that they can focus on their overarching activity instead of trying to expand to many activities and areas to secure funding. Of course, our paper cannot really distinguish between the good personal gains, so the altruism trying to offer and maximize social demands, and the bad personal gains, so to capture the personal perks or to signal competence and secure a future career for the managers. We cannot do that within our framework, and we're looking on this. We're trying to do more on this, and of course, all of the issues related to the local treatment effects is applied in our IV estimation. So we can't really say anything about how the NGOs who are not affected by the flood in terms of their decision-making process would react to the change in the funding. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the speech. Thank you very much.